Artists and the creative industries they inspire are among Australia's most valuable assets. They connect us, tell our stories, and challenge us to experience different perspectives. They interpret our past, explore and imagine our futures, and reflect our humanity. Technology also connects us. We have never been more connected. But with this comes a profoundly important question. Where is the human in the new terrain? Are we amplified or diminished? Is there a space in between art and technology to be imagined that we need to be aware of and indeed make sense of? At the Australia Council, we're thinking a lot about the future of culture and creativity, how art will be made, distributed, experienced, and what decisions need to be made now to positively influence the future, recognising our responsibility to those who will follow us. For example, our research tells us that there is a significant increase in the number of artists applying their skills in other industries. Half of all professional Australian artists are now applying their creative skills outside the arts, up from around a third in 2009. And artists continue to explore new terrain, testing the fluidity and diminishing boundaries of future practice. There is an increasing trend for artists to undertake creative work in more than one art form, all of which suggests the vital role artists will play in our future workforce. More than ever before, investing in cultural and creative literacy will create value, cultural value, social value, and indeed significant economic value. Cultural and creative occupations and industries already contribute around $112 billion to our GDP. That's a big number, which is 30% increase on 2009. Predictive data released by Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, tells us that creative jobs are likely to see a growth rate of 87% by 2030, in contrast with a sharp decline across more traditional industries. At the Council, we have recently launched a new body of work, Arts Futures, that aims to identify, understand and harness the challenge and opportunities of disruption itself. Through research and collaboration, this work will activate and grow the capacity of our cultural and creative industries to share knowledge, experience and networks. The future we want to make at the Australia Council is one where arts, culture and creativity are recognised as central to our humanity, recognised also as a public good that is valuable and one in which we invest because art and creativity enrich both our individual lives and our communities. Tonight and across Sydney we are surrounded by such creativity. Soon to come to life on the Opera House sails, and we have an excellent view behind us, we will see how Andrew Hung drew on Australian native plants as inspiration, then worked with dancer Jenna Maroney using motion capture to guide the movement of their arts, capturing the essence of the space in between. The work is described as underscoring the connection between the human body, architecture, and the natural world. So, what does it mean to be creative within a world where the future is increasingly shaped by technology? What is the place of the human in this? It's time to find out. I'm going to introduce now our panellists. First, Astrid Edwards will facilitate tonight's panel. Astrid is a writer, teacher, podcaster, and interviewer. She teaches writing at RMIT University and coordinates the Associate Degree of Professional Writing and Editing. Professor Jean Moyle is Associate Dean, International and Advancement for the Creative Industries Faculty at QUT. A former professional dancer, her current work spans the performing arts, psychology, elite sport, and corporate domains. Welcome, Jean, and thank you. Emre Deniz is a multi-award-winning game and technology developer responsible for founding Opaque Space and the Earthlight franchise. Emre has been involved as an artist and game designer in various VR, AR productions with a variety of collaborators across a range of industries including health, defence and space. Jenna Lee is a multidisciplinary artist. Jenna is a Larakia, Wardaman and Karajari woman. She is also the recipient of Australia Council's 2019 Dreaming Award. Through her art, Jenna explores language, labels and objects and how these intersect to create or challenge the concept of identity. And finally, Seb Chan is Chief Experience Officer at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in Melbourne. He is currently interested in the intersection between digital and physical spaces, cultivating innovation and experimentation in teams and helping organisations deal with changing technologies. Please welcome Astrid and our panel.
Firstly, thank you all so much for being here tonight. My name is Astrid, I will be your facilitator. So, to start with, while we are talking about the human and the creative, I thought we would make sure we don't forget what technology means. So Jean, first question, can you introduce us to Industry 4.0?
Certainly. So when we think about where we're currently at, coming from steam power to mass production through to automation, Industry 4.0 is focused upon augmented reality, virtual reality, kind of thinking systems, big data, blockchain. And so, with that process has been the consideration and a lot of research that's gone into how our jobs in the future of work what will it look like, how will that turn out, and what's our role as a human being within that. And as the research to date has identified, the key areas that can't be automated are things like creativity, surprise, surprise, and social intelligence. So I think it's very apt that we're here tonight talking about, that intersection of creativity, the arts and technology.
I could not agree more, but it would be remiss of us to blithely continue talking about technology and the arts without pausing to consider everything that technology can encompass. And I know Seb, down the end here, has some perfect thoughts on this.
I guess I've been in the technology space for probably about 25 years now, and I think what I've lived through is a decentralisation and now a re-centralisation of technology and the companies behind that. And we need to be careful that we don't assume a decentralised technology model. Technology companies bring their own biases, the data sets that inform AI. The training data sets are themselves the products of a biased culture and society. And we need to be careful, particularly as artists, that we don't feed and fuel that more. And I think we just need to be, artists need to be critical of the medium that they work with. And if you're working with technology, you need to be even more critical, particularly as it's difficult to remove ourselves from globalization and colonialism and all these other things. Technology is deeply intertwined with that.
So our starting point tonight, I think, is that technology is not neutral, and it can be used for good and for ill, I think, depending on who is in control of that. So in light of starting there, perhaps Emery, you can start, but I'd like your opinion, everybody. What does creativity mean to you in your practice?
I think it is completely to do with providing a form of experience and a spectrum of escapism and always a sort of expression that could be more often than not political for players to experience and engage in, or to make their own, depending on what you're building.
I guess my art practice is twofold. I have a commercial art practice in which is completely digitally based. I'm a commercial graphic designer by trade, but my personal art practice focuses a lot on self-identity and the external forces of identification, and then how we choose to identify ourselves and how those don't always line up all the time.
How does technology shape your art? For example, if it wasn't 2019, if it was 1919, what medium would you be creating in?
The idea of technology 200-300 years ago was different kind of paint pigmentation and the way that it would dry, or the type of canvas that was used, or how different materials were sculpted. So even nowadays, the tool sets and the platforms become interchangeable to the experiences and the commodities that we want to build. But I think they have a lot of more implications now. So sometimes when we build a technology or something as a part of our creative expression, it could be like a back-end tool or a platform or a way of collecting or curating data. We end up having a lot more unintended consequences or sometimes intended consequences that end up being used for different means. And that's, in my personal history, how I was making games, and then I started kind of working with military, and then I kind of started doing all this other stuff because one expression led to a hydra of different consequences.
Yeah, I agree. I think technology as a tool, being an Aboriginal artist, I come from a 60,000 year history of creating art and storytelling with the tools around you. The tools that happen to be around me are the Adobe Creative Suite, and I love them deeply. However, interestingly, about 2 years ago, I went through a process of needing to find an outlet to balance my commercial art practice, which was all in my commercial life. Pen does not touch paper. I work completely within the computer on a Wacom tablet, but I actually balanced with an art practice that is primarily at the moment sculpting with paper pulp. It's very hands-on, it's very intimate. It involves ripping and tearing and shaping and playing with water, and I think for me it's about that balance, and that what I was missing in my art practice, creating commercial digital works, I needed to find again, and that's just a personal reaction, that I needed to re-find my human connection with the art. But yeah, again, I think technology is just a brand new fun tool.
Now, art doesn't have to be created to be shared necessarily. It can be a private expression. So much of it is shared in the modern world that we live in. Seb, how are you starting to see, and how are you helping audiences engage with all forms of art?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things with digital and particularly network technologies that surround us today are two key things. One is their opacity. It's very hard to see process and effect. So kind of like using pen or paper or ink or any other analog tool, there's a degree of opacity, and it requires a degree of technological literacy to underpick the process. So one of the things that I've been working on since my work at the Powerhouse, also with the Smithsonian in New York and now in Melbourne, at the Australian Centre for Moving Image, it's about revealing process. It's very much about removing the, making the process legible. I think it's very difficult for some forms of art to consent to legibility. When you were talking about what might have occurred in 1919, I think a lot about the way magic shows, stage magic grew up around the birth of electricity, and it was a way of revealing the magic of electricity through the stage magic. But now if you look at how magicians work on YouTube, and you can slow down an illusionist's trick to 0.25 times and see what they're doing. Magic, the practice of magic used to be about holding on to process. You didn't ever share your process, much like a theatre maker might not share their stage tricks. I just saw the Harry Potter show with my kids in Melbourne. I want to know how some of that stuff works, right? I think audiences do now too. So there's that sense of revealing and making process opaque. And that's one of the things, I guess, in my practice with museums and art galleries, I'm very conscious of, trying to force the issue on. I'm not interested in an artist holding back on how they did things. The role of the institution is to demystify and pull apart and recontextualise a work so that it becomes legible, particularly technology-based art. And we see this in the, what used to be the DVD bonus features, now YouTube featurettes on special effects. It's all about revealing process. So the one thing is the opacity problem of technology-based art. And I think back to the web and the idea of view source being such a key part of the internet and or how the web grew. The second one is about scale, and that we can't pull away from the scale effects and the illegibility of scale effects. And I think you touched on it previously, that notion of the unintended scale effects of things. And again, if you mix the opacity and scale, it can cause some serious social problems and cultural problems. So I think the role of institutions now is about legibility and about creating an artistic technological literacy in the community, with our communities, I should say.
I would like us to continue to unpack that, but before we quite get there, Jean, you have been a professional dancer but also a psychologist. How are you seeing different industries engage with the arts and the artists within them?
I think the recognition, I think as Adrian mentioned before, so many of our creatives and artists are moving their practice outside of what would be traditional kind of art areas of practice. And I think it's that broader understanding, within sectors of the creative process and what that can actually bring to, the business, the organisation, in a way that they wouldn't necessarily, they're not trained in that process. And sometimes that ability to unpack that and connect those things. So certainly, in my experience, the benefit of bringing dance and psychology together has been to advance areas in science and arts to support, creative health, or areas that are advancing ways in which we're utilising arts, in this case dance, to support people with disease or illness or health. And I like to look at dance as a kind of health by stealth type of thing, that everyone can dance. Now, there might be different levels of quality within that, but that ability to how we're looking at those kind of big challenges out there in terms of health and obesity and issues in that domain, that can actually be fed through an art form. The more opportunities we have to put different brains together from a creative and a science perspective, the better off we are in terms of actually hitting some of those big world challenges.
Which makes me think of your involvement with military and strategy. I mean, gaming has always kind of been involved with scenario planning and that kind of thinking side, even though it's inherently a fun and playful thing to do. But, I mean, do you agree with Jean, Emre?
First of all, I got to clarify that I profoundly disagree that everyone can dance. I can't dance at all. Corporate industries are engaging in artists as long as artists provide a commodity and a value. I think that everything outside of that starts to stray into the territory of us seeing good intent when the intent is a bottom line. In terms of, for example, the work that we've done in consulting or working with the military in both here and other several countries, including the United States, it was always good intentions, but it doesn't change the fact that it furthers an agenda that is holistically not a good intent. And arguably, in the context of 2019, there's very little corporate entities or industries that have holistically good intent or good footprints left. So I think they reach out to us as long as we're valuable as a product.
I would also like us to talk about the value of art, particularly in the digital age. We live in a culture where it's completely acceptable for someone to spend, an hour finding the perfect Instagram filter and end up with a great thing to look at. If you have art online, if you choose to share your work somewhere on the web, how do we value that?
Well, it's easy. It's quantified. You get a little love heart, and
is a little love heart, is hundreds of thousands of Instagram likes or Twitter followers or whatever metric that you want to take, is that valuable? I mean, is there a difference between art and content online?
Oh, not at all.
You don't think so?
I think that Grumpy Cat, for example, is
R.I.P. by the way.
Yeah, R.I.P. Case. Grumpy Cat, I think, is as much of a cultural marker to a younger generation of people as a lot of culturally significant works have been to different peoples prior. I never want to make that distinction because it feels like we're devaluing the work and the significance of that's held like really dear by generations that are coming after us. So I always say that it is a form of art, even if it's online content, because a platform never really matters. And yeah, like likes and RTs, that's what it's all about. But prior to that, it was about which art gallery would sign you up, and prior to that, which pope's going to give you money to paint something, and then prior to that was, who's going to, I don't know what they did before that. Maybe wage wars.
They were always patrons.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm interested in everybody else's thoughts. So I mean, Emery is definitely in the camp of an Instagram post or anything online can be art and valued as such. Said?
No, I disagree. I think that there's creative works and creative output, and there is also capital A art as a contemporary art commodity in a different form. I think one of the big challenges as the tools of creation, distribution, and now also financialization have become more democratized and widely available. I shouldn't say democratized, they're kind of not, they're just available. What we're actually seeing is a flattening. And I've talked a bit about this in the past in other forums about when we use the word content, it flattens everything. And what we should be talking about is context. So if you go across to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, they have a retrospective at the moment of Duchamp, and it's about context. So art is defined by the context in which it's shown and viewed in, really. And what we see with content, we've seen this with music as well, is a flattening and a loss of context. So it's great that I can get a make-out soundtrack playlist from Spotify or a gym playlist from Spotify. I don't go to the gym, but if I wanted to go to the gym, Spotify could provide me a content to quantify and make more quantifiable my gym experience and make my health better, apparently, in a quantified way. But in doing that, it is flattening all of the context of difference around those particular songs. It is very different from me putting a Chicago house track with a piece of finished death metal together for a friend, which is contextualized by the metadata that surrounds it, the record sleeve, the producers, the studio it was recorded in, all those liner notes and all that context that was rich in the analog world that hasn't been ported across to the digital world, despite the possibility of it being there. It is flattened beneath a universalized global interface for music as playlist. Now that's been great because it's given me the chance to hear music I otherwise wouldn't have heard, and my kids to grow up with both finished death metal and Chicago house and everything in between, Nigerian funk and all sorts of other things. But it has taken the specificity of those away. And with that flattening, you lose an emotional investment in it. Music has become wallpaper for our lives that is quantified and flattened to serve other interests and monetized in ways that the money does not flow to the creator. It gets monetized and sold to brands who can then optimize for aesthetic experiences that meet their bottom line, not the artist making it.
You both are in different camps. I'm going to show my age and admit that I did not know who Grumpy Cat was until Grumpy Cat passed away. That was not part of my cultural experience. So to add to the discussion of, whether it's art or content, maybe we're looking at that, age influences that as well. Jenna, your thoughts?
Yeah, because I actually, and this might be showing my age, I love memes and I think they are art. I think it's how I don't understand the new generation's memes, and I love that. I know that they're hilarious.
They're odd.
dabbing. I don't know what that is, but that's okay. I personally, I grew up with social media. I'm 26, so it's been there since I started grade 8. But for me, social media is a way that I actually get my art out there. In saying that, I am very, very purposeful in the way that I do that. And I will admit, I very rarely get more than 50 likes. I'm curating, the way I see it is my Instagram account is my art journal. And that's how I use it. And again, I'm in the camp of it's a tool. I don't make memes as art, I will admit. But I think that, for example, there's that idea of Instagram art these days, and I happen to love Instagram art because while I was raised around museums and art galleries, Instagram art is in my opinion, getting a new generation of people into spaces that they weren't comfortable in, and that if you can get someone from a generation who wouldn't have walked into the door of a museum, that's a fantastic thing, and do everything you can to keep them and to lead them around that space. So while if your opinion of Instagram art is it's not valid, use it to get them in the door, and then create spaces that you find valid, but in a way that they are comfortable interacting. If a 12-year-old can walk into a museum or art gallery and have a phenomenal cultural experience because there was a velvet, fluffy, pink room that's going to look amazing on their Instagram, that's a good thing, I think, personally.
Jean, your thoughts?
Look, I agree. I think that ability to, if you're getting somebody in and you're creating an opportunity them to access and then be in the context and have an experience that they might never have ever had before, or only seen it through a digital or online presence, I think it's then down to, well, what's the venue or the artist doing to ensure that that's something that might get them in the door to go and take an Instagram of the Mona Lisa, but maybe once they're in there, they connect with something there or have some kind of experience that, makes them curious about following, and exploring something further. So I think it's that aspect of, we've all found our own ways to access art or culture or be creative. That might be that way for this particular generation, but wow, if they get there and have that connection, isn't that fantastic? Yeah.
But I think there is that balance, because if you're just putting an Instagram art in a space and that's the only thing you're doing for that generation, that's where it's not going to work, and that's where you get that loss of context, because it's what you build around those interactions that's where that matters. So it is a balancing act, and I don't know that everywhere does it amazingly yet.
I don't think places know how to do it. As someone who's built experiences that have been very shareable on social and designed for that purpose, but also been someone who's looked at collecting GIFs and other and memes for museum collections and doing exhibits of those things. It's not necessarily about the medium. It's actually about intent and how that intent is expressed. And I think there's this really interesting balance between accessibility to authentic experiences and accessibility to flattened experiences. And it's really, when I was growing up, doing putting on clubs and playing at clubs and putting on parties and all these sort of things in the music space, and this translates to art museums and other things too. There was a very particular safety for diverse communities in exclusivity. That safe environments are often exclusive environments for marginalised communities, and that's important. And there are also spaces where meaning gets made. And access to those, broad access, comes at a price. And that price is not always realised until exclusivity is reduced. Now, to shine a light on the exclusivity is very different from flattening it. Ritual matters. The rituals of accessing culture are what makes culture different to content, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Perhaps not expressing it very well, but the rituals matter. There's reasons, for instance, we had a welcome to country that was about practice and respect and coming into a place with a respect for cultural practices, not a flattening of, oh, I get access to a talking event without respect. So there's that. So some interesting things in how we navigate that, and I think digital network digital tools and social media particularly comes with its own rituals and practices that are generationally specific and evolve. Think of how your grandparents used Facebook versus you never using it. Those rituals matter, but what is not clear is we don't always have a literacy around those things. We're not always aware of that, and I think there's museum literacy. How do I feel comfortable, and how am I supposed to behave in particular spaces? Much as there is a Twitter literacy or Snapchat literacy or other things.
You've introduced the idea of accessibility, and the internet obviously opens up so many different avenues for all of us. I would like to also throw in the idea of the gatekeepers to art. There have been many traditionally. In some ways, I think they are now gone. Emre and Jenna, you don't necessarily have to find someone to exhibit your work. You can find an audience online. So I'd like to look at the other side of accessibility and ask, do you need any of the institutions to be a practicing artist anymore?
I do, because they have all my cultural objects in their storehouses. So yes, I still need them, but I'm quite happy to see them completely dismantle the way that they operate and then be rebuilt. However, I still want to be an exhibiting artist. I think that the way that we can exhibit and making exhibitions accessible is a priority. But in saying that, the way that I have found people who want to exhibit my work is on my Instagram account. And it's not that I very rarely post finished works. I post what I'm interested in, I post works in progress, and then every now and then I'll get somebody contact me. For example, I had an artist contact me a couple of weeks ago who's interested in doing a collaborative exhibition. She's from Colombia, and the other artist involved is from Sri Lanka, and she'd like to talk about how colonization has impacted the way that we practice art today. She found me on Instagram. That's incredible. For me, I wouldn't have had that opportunity without that. And I know so many artists who build websites after Instagram because people are begging to buy their content, so for me, it can be a good thing. However, on the flip side, it can be also an incredibly anxiety-inducing space where that little love heart or the repost or the share. And I think, fortunately, being on the older spectrum of the youth, that generation that grew up using it, I can detach slightly, and I understand that it is a tool. However, my worry is that for the generation coming up now, that it's not a tool. It's a pervasive part of their everyday life. So I think that's where there's some danger zones still involved in these technologies. But for me, it's been beneficial. But at the same time, I think I spent about 4 hours on Twitter today. That's a long time to spend on Twitter. Yeah, okay. I only just got it, so I'm still working out how to use it. But it's a long time.
Oh yeah, I mean, institutions in Australia generally hate video games, and that's fine, because video games will outlive those institutions eventually. The art that I'll give a good example. I once made drawings of Disney princesses with Space Marine armor, and if you don't know what a Space Marine is, don't worry about it. Basically, they were holding very big guns and bloodied axes, and that made a whole bunch of publications around the world from just Twitter alone. I got a lot of really angry guys messaging me over it, which was cool, but it was interesting to see the nature of how I was able to distribute artwork that I did because I was angry at some online neckbeard at the time, and for it to have this huge political message and a meaning, and even a hate culture around that grew up around the artwork, and the way that it's spread. But the flip side of the coin is that the institutions are actually really critical in educating the public, as well as educating the older generations and their own kind of, I guess, the people on the other side of those gates that are kept into the value of what we have outside in the cold without the government funding. I think there's a lot of good advocates in those institutions and a lot of really, really powerful individuals who try to make a difference and try to kind of change the course, but they're probably always fighting their internal politics on a daily basis. Our industry has experienced it really severely. We got given a bunch of money in the Abbott days for a grant for making video games in Australia, and then the program was quite profitable, so they scrapped it, which makes sense in hindsight, and we've never seen it since. And that was like the same year that I got into making video games.
We're going to come back to that with the question about what can we do in the future. But I'd just like to go to you now, Jean, and perhaps everybody else on the panel. We have obviously been talking about technology and what it means to be a creative and human. And we've kind of implied that maybe everything online can be good, but does art sometimes divide us online? And I'm thinking about, who we follow on Instagram or what bubble we exist in online. So I'd like to tease apart the assumption that art always brings us together and always makes us that little bit more human online.
Well, even thinking about it from a psychology perspective, is that we're seeing more and more issues in terms of loneliness and social isolation, even though we're more connected online, digitally and globally than we have ever been. And I think it's that aspect of kind of similar to what was being said before about kind of music, we're curating our own worlds online. So whilst it gives us that opportunity for people across the world to connect with us and for us to see things that we would never normally see, we're also, and because of the algorithms that sit behind things, the more that we like and the more dopamine that drops in our heads because we get those responses in that way, we're actually potentially narrowing our experience online and heading towards those things that we're more drawn to or more like versus the things that might challenge us. That in an analogue world, we might have gone out and seen things and had a response to that versus, well, actually, that's not something that I'm interested in searching or Googling further or following, so that I'm actually creating or curating my own more narrow world in that sense, which can be a challenge as well.
Yeah, I think the web is certainly balkanising more than it has in a long time. Again, it's a centralisation of platforms and control, and the economics behind those. Similarly with video games, my museum's arguably the National Museum of Video Games. We collect, we support, do all sorts of stuff. We do big exhibitions of video games. When we think about how do we collect and show video games, say in 2025, almost certainly those will be non-physical. They will not, much as a museum, National Museum of Television, how do we collect productions that are only made for Netflix? There is no copy, there is only the stream. These are really challenging things, and what we're seeing is where the institutional gatekeepers arguably were in the past, or gallerists in the contemporary art world, what you're seeing is platform centralisation now. So there's some interesting policy decisions to be made around that, and there's some interesting decisions for makers too about realising what the platform economics are. What your share is, arguably the App Store in 2008-09, really created a huge new gaming audience and market, but at what cost? And as we go further on, how does that play out? Steam and other things, itch, all these things. But at the same time, we're seeing really interesting things around accessibility and things that are around people watching people play too. The rise of people watching people play games at scale, both in the esports space, but also Twitch and Discord and other things. And what does that mean for the economics of that? Who is actually, whose product is being monetized there? It's the game maker, the broadcaster, these kinds of things. So there's different things going on, but I do think at the moment there is a re-centralisation, and that's what we as creators and also as curators need to be aware of, that we play a role in that as well. We're not passive in that. We have opportunities to engage around things and opportunities to ask for a different setup.
Talking about creators and curators, one of the things that art has always done for us is to pose questions. It challenges us, it often challenges the status quo, or whatever that is of the day, and it makes us think. Now, I don't know, and I would like you to consider what the role is of our contemporary creatives in challenging us all, particularly if we fall down our own Instagram niches or niches online, for the two big challenges that we face. So the biggest challenge to our environment is the climate change, our physical environment, and the biggest challenge to our digital world and the technology that we're talking about is the development of artificial intelligence. So do we expect artists and curators to help us think about these big issues that confront us all? Jean, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, hasn't that been what art has been about, which has been challenging us to think in different ways, to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to have an experience or think from a different perspective. You know, I think we artists and creative industries have a huge role to play in climate change, sustainability, those challenges, as well as when we think about kind of artificial intelligence and what it does it mean to be human, as I mentioned before, well, what are those qualities that make us human, and how are we challenging people to think about, I've seen a range of exhibits where looking from kind of a robotics perspective, getting that sense of putting ourselves in, well, what does that mean to be, a robot from that, from that side? Why do we tend to be more comfortable with robots or artificial intelligence that looks more like us as opposed to something that doesn't? And I think that challenging our thinking, putting thoughts out there, appropriately in that way, or not appropriately, if that's the intent as well, I think is certainly central to what being creative, what role we have to play.
Those challenges, I think, are going to be even more pronounced, and the role of creatives is either to provide a challenge or an aesthetic, basically. Which is a really scary way of kind of framing that, but our way of life along many different verticals are facing a range of challenges, and then the content and art we create is either self-serving for the artist in the form of self-indulgence or commercialization, like for corporate reasons or like their own personal kind of gain, or it's about education or informing people or holding people accountable. I think whether or not, like the AI question is a really interesting one. Everyone's really afraid of this idea of artificial intelligence, and creatives tend to think that they will be the last to be impacted by it, but I kind of think that they're going to be the first in line to go down. At the last RMI, like the last kind of panel that we did in RMIT last year, I remember talking about how they had AI-generated artwork paired up in a blind kind of blind, not study, but like a gallery, at an art gallery where people were asked to pick between two paintings, and the majority of people picked the artwork that was generated by a computer as opposed to a human painter. And that is, of course, lacking context, but we've come a long way since then. And now we can generate procedurally developed actors, music and artwork, where if you do not provide the context, that we don't know who made it, or we can lie about the context. So I think there's a bigger question at play in that we need to remove the money that drives art in order to make AI a part of our tool set as opposed to a threat, and then in terms of like something like climate change, there's a much bigger discussion. I think art's main responsibility will be about holding people to account.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody here follows Lil Michaela on Instagram, but she is a completely artificial being who recently was in an ad campaign for Calvin Klein where she, a fake woman, kissed a straight woman, and I identify as queer, and that was infuriating because the tagline was something along the lines of, dream of a reality unimaginable. Kissing a woman is not a dream unimaginable for me. So I think that's where this starts to be, because she has no fallout. She has no repercussions. There's no fallout for her because she doesn't exist. She's not a real person. She can't be held accountable for her actions. And that's where I find AI, and I will admit I don't even dabble in this area in my art practice, and so that's kind of where my feelings are about it, that how can we hold people accountable that don't exist for their actions?
That's a very good question.
Especially when you don't know who the people behind her are.
Yeah. Seb, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing the AI being added to most of the tools, most of the commercial creative tool sets now, or definitely in their next releases, which for a lot of commercial art production and design work will get rid of a lot of the less interesting repetitive tasks, which were previously out kind of sourced to the developing world anyway, arguably. And we've also seen a lot of the more popular AI products that are claimed to be being done by machines actually being done by factories of workers in the developing world. Or assisted by, which is interesting and politically problematic potentially. But I think, around the point around social change, I think the real value of art in this period of increasingly visible wicked problems that can only be solved at scale, at a societal level, not by us working by ourselves, but by us working collectively. It's the power of art to bring people together, to see that we do need to work together rather than separately. And it's interesting to see also, how other countries with less kind of individualistic models of culture, say for example China, will be able to potentially move at a different pace, and we need to find a way that large-scale societal change doesn't become authoritarian change, but realising that, to roll out, I was in China last year, and the presence of solar everywhere I was going was amazing, and also the developments in AI that are invisible to us in the West are phenomenal. And there's a whole other internet there that you're not aware of until you're there, and so there's that piece too, that I think this type of change we need is at a national scale but also at a global scale, and that requires artists to find ways to work across cultures and across different models of society. That's pretty challenging.
That is a huge challenge, and not one for individual artists. I'm hesitant to imply that there is a responsibility on individual artists to do so. So instead, I would like to pose you all a question, perhaps starting at this end, Jean. What institutions or infrastructure or organisations do we need to facilitate us all working together on these very large challenges that art has traditionally helped us think about?
I think for me, from when we're looking at kind of the technology and digital connection, Adrian mentioned before Nesta and some of the work that they've done in supporting and creating and pulling together, creative industries, science, the digital aspects, with support, overarchingly in terms of funding and how we're developing capabilities and how we're connecting things in that way. That's an organisation that I've always, been impressed with in looking at what is it that they're doing, and they're doing it on scale in that way. And I know it sits in a very particular area, but certainly that combination of looking at capacity building, connection points, developing that so people are being able to connect together in a way rather than feeling like I have to individually try and capacity build, or I might come from a background where I'm naturally working with technology versus somebody that doesn't. So how are we thinking about that from that kind of capacity building perspective? Capacity and connection would be the thing from my side of things.
Two good words. Emery?
I think what's lacking is that the conversations around art are so entrenched that we are really making an effort to alienate a variety of people, or dictating to them about how they should express themselves as we think they should. I kind of feel like this happens a lot with how institutions especially dictate how multiculturalism should be expressed, when there is, thousands of years of ideas that can go into what a power fantasy could be, or what narrative design could be, or what artistic color theory could be, that we don't really tap into because we have certain conditions and restrictions of how we think art should be created in order to support, fund, and curate it. I kind of feel like any institution that will deconstruct and arguably decolonize a lot of that is going to be really beneficial. And I know that there's a range of people actually working towards that, but it comes up a lot in my field, especially around video games, about how much of this concept of interactive media has been influenced by very specific Anglo-inspired Western kind of ideologies, and how much of that we need to actually deconstruct and then critically look at. And I think it all begins at at the concept of gatekeeping, or at the concept of saying this is your price of admission to join our art club. We need to outreach more.
Jenna?
I mean, I can't agree any more possibly with everything you just said. I think one thing that it always comes back to is that governments and institutions and people in power need to talk to and listen to people. I think that if we're talking about institutions bringing people in the door, I think the most important question is, why aren't they in the door to begin with? What are the barriers stopping them? Is it price? Is it the perception of exclusivity? I mean, I could go on and on about that as well, but I think too, this is going to sound very simple, and I'm sure it's not an easy, but consistent funding for the arts and for creatives. I think I'm in a wonderful position of privilege where I can afford to live this, to do this, but I think it is difficult, having worked in institutions. I used to work in museums in Brisbane, and am currently working with museums in the UK, and I think money. We need to value creatives, and we need to value, and I think for me that idea of STEM and making sure that it's always STEAM, that the arts involved, because in my opinion, and I've had conversations with my cousin who's doing physics or something like that, without arts to make science accessible to the general public, science won't get the funding because the buy-in's not there. So money is my answer. I don't know where it comes from though.
That's tricky. Said?
Soft infrastructure and early education, I think, are the keys to this, really. That are levers that can be pulled and have been previously pulled in the past. The infrastructures available feel accessible and democratised, but really aren't, and their impacts are uneven. And when we think back to periods of time where there have been new forms of emergent culture. If I think back, I'm going to be somewhat specific here and say, I think what was interesting in the UK in the 1980s, terrible years under Thatcher, but also art schools and people going on the dole so they could go to art college. And building a business forming a band because they went to art college to be on the dole. That notion of using time, one of the things that will be freed up a lot more in the future will be time. We don't have any time at the moment, and that's one of the barriers to accessibility. Whenever I speak to visitors or do audience research, all these things with museums and galleries and libraries and other things, people talk about time as the problem, and time and social class and poverty interrelate a lot. I'm working 2 jobs because I can't afford to pay my rent. Thus, I don't actually have time. You can have a free event on, or you can have a $5 event on. I'm more happy to pay that once a year to go to a $50 event. It's not the price, it's actually because I'm setting aside the time for that. So creating those moments where there is time available for people, those are relatively easy government levers to pull that can be done at a state level, and Victoria is very progressive in a lot of things around that. Soft infrastructure too relates to the reduction of policies around use of spaces. So, we've seen in Sydney, I used to run clubs and put parties on in illegal venues and other things in Sydney. That's freaking hard to do now. There was a real flourishing of things until I left for New York. And one of the massively great things in New York was actually the soft infrastructure around the arts that had built up around density. And I think as climate, the impacts of climate change become more visible to us, that we need to get better living in denser cities. The world will become more city-oriented. Kind of knew that was occurring. We will be terrible living in cities the way we are. Australians will be the worst at it. People I've experienced at least. It's really freaking hard. And actually that notion of finding ways that people use community spaces and feel allowed to use community spaces, those sorts of things. And I think the early education piece is also about building arts education and visiting institutions as part of every primary school kid's education would be amazing. And the barriers to that are the curriculum is too full of other things, time again, and access to transport. So how are you going to get all the regional kids in the regions to come to Sydney, to come to the MCA? How are you going to do that? Well, that would be a good way of using taxpayer money. Whatever it is, you know what I mean? Like, it's that building in those moments where the community claims back the institutions that are funded by their taxes, and give them temporal ownership of those.
And time to create.
Time to create, yeah.
To create. So audience members have submitted virtually, and they're going to be read out now to the panel.
The most popular question came from Elliot Bledsoe to all the speakers. The internet we have doesn't look like the paradise we were promised. How has technology's promise failed you?
We were promised hover cars, and we were promised no climate change and a bunch of other stuff, and like living on the moon. I think that for all of the finger pointing that we do, actually technology does do a lot of good. We live in an unprecedented kind of reality where we get to see how stupid world leaders can be in real time.
I don't know if that's a good thing.
I think it's the final critical point in which we can actually start having some discourse around the people that we elect being only human, and arguably. So the idea here is that, I'm not going to ramble on too much, but I think that there is a lot of good in technology that we demonize it and we criticize it, but there's a lot of things that are happening right now that actually do a lot of good, and more creatives more than anything are at the forefront, in the spear front, and that health practitioners tend to be people that are really deploying technology for the best that it can do and to fulfill those promises. But the idea of paradise definitely comes from the 1990s thing of, think about the customer's always right, and let's fulfill everyone's power fantasies. And those things were promised to a very specific demographic of people. And those people definitely made out much better than a multicultural or diverse groups of people. So now we're getting like our equity as well.
If it's that technology has just been such a part of my life, I can't work out where it's done me wrong because it's just always been there. For me, technology, from a very personal perspective, has given me the opportunity to have commercial success sharing my culture, or one of my cultures, creating, which again, it's a money thing. There's a want from corporates and governments and institutions to demonstrate their want to reconcile, and that they pay people like me to create them works that demonstrate that. There's probably always the grey space next to that of whether that's a genuine commitment or not. So I'm trying really hard to think of how, because currently technology is what gives me a living.
Not a bad thing.
No, I like to eat and live.
So I think, as somebody in my late 40s that hasn't grown up, thankfully, with technology right from the beginning, I think in thinking of coming into that and feeling like, I remember sending my first text message on and emailing for the first time, or getting on the internet for the first time. And I think the positives of that in being able to access or see parts of the world or see what was going on in a way you just could never do. So even kind of talking now to dance students to say we had to send away for videos of dance companies to find out what kind of repertoire they used to do to see if we even liked it, to then go overseas to audition for them or do a tour to actually go, you can search out now and find maybe what's going on that you connect with in a way that you just never could before. And I think that aspect, so kind of the flip side of what I responded to before, where we're curating experiences this way, also that benefit is that we're able to see, watch, experience things that we might never in our lifetime have ever seen before, and that's pretty incredible.
Actually, I just thought of the negative, sorry. Anxiety. It's a lot to look at everything all the time, and I think that's why particularly my generation do curate our experiences, because seeing everything all the time is so overwhelming. And I think that maybe that's where we need to be a bit better as humans. Well, I mean, on that, from a brain perspective, we just don't have the processing power. And so that's whereby, as well, our brains are getting overloaded by all of the information coming in at all times, where you stop to take a break and you look at something, or there's constant, and that's where we talk about, from a creative perspective, how we're creating that space and time to do things. So completely agree around how we're aware of that, how we're aware of the likes and the hearts, having a brain interaction with us, and we're getting addicted to that as well, so that kind of flip side, also being mindful of that.
I mean, I think we live in an eternal present, which is deeply problematic. That what we've ended up with, is that problem of not being able to see the near future because we're stuck in what's happening right now. And I think that's been weaponised, particularly by the right, the alt-right, and recent politics. That weaponisation of the eternal present means that you have no ability to have foresight, you have no time. And it was very different in the early 90s with the promise of the end of the web. I remember the cusp of the web, and I think the promise of bringing together people around the world on a network was very utopian and naive, that everybody, once they got on the network, would be nice. They totally wouldn't be.
They certainly are not.
And they're not. But what we've lacked is an ability to understand the weaponisation of that. I was just reading a fascinating piece in Foreign Policy, I think, about the nature of spycraft and how spycraft has completely changed with the mobile device and the ubiquity, the inability of spies to go off the grid and have alternative identities, because even the alternative identities have no trace before them. So that inability to escape the network is something that we haven't seen coming up around us, and that's affected everything. So again, it comes back to the illegibility, the opacity of not technology as a whole, that's too broad, but networked technology is opaque, and the key to unlocking some of this is removing its opacity, and that's hard. That's education, it's experience, it's contemporary art that challenges us around this. It's talking to people. It's all those things, but getting beyond the eternal present is super important.
The human connection. So thank you all. I'd like you to give an applause to the panel.